My name is Jason Baldus. I'm a member of the Eastern Shoshone tribe, um, born and raised on the Wind River Indian Reservation in Fort Washakie. I received my undergraduate and graduate degrees in land resources and environmental science from Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana. I currently work as the Tribal Buffalo Program Manager for the National Wildlife Federation's Tribal Partnerships Program. I sit on a couple boards, including the Intertribal Buffalo Council and the Conservation Lands Foundation. I sit on the Environmental Commission of the Congress of Nations and States. So I'm very pleased to be an advocate for the Red Desert, not only as a tribal member, but as a conservationist. And I have been involved with Citizens for the Red Desert for a number of years as an advocate. And I, Shoshone people have a very long history here, and including the Red Desert, somewhat recognized in the 1863 treaty that established a 44 million acre reservation. Only 5 years later, it was reduced by 42 million acres in 1868. So the loss of our lands is no dissimilar story to many tribes, but today our access to and rights of traditional territories is a very important issue in terms of how conservation overlaps with our traditional ecological knowledge and protection of sacred sites and special places. So I'm very, very glad to be part of the call and the conversation today. And I'll go ahead and pass it on. I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Before I pass it to Yufna, what's one hope that you have for the participants on this training today?
One hope is that our story will be told in a way that is respectful and appreciative of the contributions that Native Americans and certain tribes, and well, every tribe makes to the story of America, our history, as well as contemporary opportunities that we may have to share with each other. So I just hope that can be done in a good way, and look forward to sharing how that can happen.
Thank you. Yufna.
Niake Dos Besit Neteena. My name is Yufna Soldrov. I said hello, all my relatives. I am Northern Arapaho. I am the Wind River organizer for the Wyoming Outdoor Council. One of the things I'm really looking forward to is this media training and being on the panel and really moving forward and helping the journalists see how we can write stories to benefit how we tell our narratives as tribes. So I didn't want to get too far into that, but as far as the introduction, I'm hoping that one of the things we do move forward in doing with the tour is hoping that a lot of people after this is over is seeing the beautiful landscape. And it's really hard to be a land advocate because you have to be out in the land. When we talk about our language and our culture, we were always immersed in our environment, the wilderness. So many times we're taught in Western perspective that we're apart from that. But as Indigenous people, we are a part of the land, and that's who we are. And it's really hard to bring those two perspectives together. And today, I hope that's what we can do. And I hope that our tour does the same. That is all I have for right now. And thank you for all being here.
Thank you, Yufna and Jason. So Yufna, I'm gonna start with this question to you. Can you tell me why you think it's important that we, and journalists in particular, incorporate tribal perspectives in a place like the Red Desert?
I think growing up in the Red Desert, going there with my father, going there with very different people at very different times, looking at various places as a child, I always thought, wow, this is a beautiful place. And people don't really get to see that very often. You know, it's that drive that no one wants to drive, but they don't realize how great it is once you go off-roading. And the landscape there is beautiful. I was thought growing up, why don't people know about this? So it's this kind of hidden away place, and it's beautiful. And kind of like I said in my introduction, it's hard to get people to understand how beautiful, and it can only speak for itself once you see this landscape, and you can bring in that full experience of, wow, you know, this is a beautiful place. I'm hoping that a lot of the journalists who come into this will walk away with telling that story and being able to show pictures and tell various stories, and, you know, look into interviewing the tribes, you know, talk about, you know, whose ancestral land this was, and really, you know, be accurate in depicting that narrative is really important. So I'm hoping that as we move forward in this training, people will, the journalists will be like, okay, yeah, this is worth writing about. But really just what it comes back to is appreciating the landscape. And I think that's probably the best answer I have.
Thank you, Yufna. Jason, can you provide us some history about the Shoshone people arriving, or I guess creating the reservation, and how that process started?
The Shoshone people have been in this area for 13,000 years by the archaeological evidence. We have we claim to be here much longer, more like 30,000 years. The highest elevation buffalo jumps have been found in the Wind Rivers. Recently, a complex of 10 drive lines and 5 buffalo jumps was identified just north of the present day reservation that was used by Shoshone people for essentially managing buffalo. The sheep eater band of the Shoshones have been living in the mountains and subsisting on the bighorn sheep for millennia. They were primarily non-horse users, but we still see evidence of their sheep drive lines. So the history of Shoshone people in this location, in this region, goes back thousands and thousands of years. And interestingly, we speak the Uto-Aztecan dialect, the Numic branch of the Uto-Aztecan dialect that comes from the south. So the roots of the language come from the Aztec people. So the Red Desert itself was a thoroughfare for trade, and the Indian Gap Trail, for instance, is one of those thoroughfares that was part of a vast trade network that existed amongst the tribes. The Comanche were part of our people here in this region several hundred years prior to European arrival. They went south following the large buffalo herds and became what we know as the Comanche. After the Pueblo revolt, the Comanches traded horses, and because we're their sister tribe, we're one of the first to have horses, and we're largely responsible for distribution of the horse to the northern tribes. If you go to the Madison River drainage in Montana, that drainage by the local tribes there was called the Horse Valley because that's the way the horse was brought by the Shoshone people. We were expert horsemen, for a couple hundred years prior to Lewis Clark's arrival. So the long history of people here and in the Red Desert, isn't diminished by the modern day boundaries and jurisdictions that we place on the landscape. Because not only were Native people imposed to land use systems, our lands were imposed to land use systems. Privatization of lands, the General Allotment Act, and other detrimental policies to remove Indian land holdings and to destroy our traditional way of life and belief system happened over decades and decades. So today we're in an era of not only self-determination, but in some ways forced federalism, where we have to interact with state governments, which diminishes the sovereignty of the tribes. There was over 800 treaties made with Native Americans, 400 of them ratified by Congress, but every single treaty was violated or broken in some way. We see the evidence on reservations all over. The General Allotment Act purposely tried to convert Native Americans to agriculturalists, and if we didn't, then our lands were removed and advertised and sold for pennies per acre to non-Native people, opening up our reservations for homesteading. These policies are now, it's now possible to essentially unwind some of these things by aligning our conservation values with our traditional beliefs and connection to the land and the animals and plants. So that's why efforts like protection of areas of the Northern Red Desert make sense, because that's our traditional territory. It was recognized in the Treaty of 1863. Vast trade networks that existed for thousands of years were part of that. But efforts like in the 90s and 2000s, where we have an influx of oil and gas development, and these entities are supposed to provide consultation or meaningful consultation with tribal governments because that's the trust responsibility. Well, those consultation meetings rarely happen, or if they do, they're not meaningful. And so then tribal interests are often not recognized, let alone listened to or implemented. And that's evidenced by the protection of the Indian Gap Trail. This trail is thousands of years old, but receives little protection or any, or a buffer zone compared to the Oregon Trail, which is young. And we have the Tri-Territories part of the Oregon Trail that recognizes when the land there belonged to England and France and Mexico. So we have to be able to tell our story in a way that is beneficial to our people and tells our story in a respectful and meaningful way, because our history books don't teach the right story. And it's up to us to be able to tell and share that now.
Thank you, Jason. A couple good questions have been coming in. First of all, I want to let everybody know that this is being recorded and it will be shared broadly. Jason, one of the participants has asked you, is it correct that the Red Desert comes from the Shoshone, that name? And you just touched on the tri-territory marker. And if there's anything else that you want to note about how it doesn't acknowledge Indigenous land claims at all.
Inga Vasa Sogop is the Shoshone term for the Red Desert, Red Dirt Country. And so that is how the interpretation of that in the Shoshone language. And, the recognition of tribal sovereignty, treaty rights, traditional hunting, off-reservation, it's challenging because what we have is oftentimes the language that's within those documents to guide philosophy. For instance, the Stevens treaties in Montana are written in such a way that those tribes that were part of the Stevens treaties have traditional hunting rights in Yellowstone. The Fort Laramie Treaty, for instance, doesn't contain the similar language, and therefore it makes it more difficult for the tribes to exercise off-reservation treaty rights that were essentially reserved by tribes within those treaties. So it oftentimes, the election of Deb Haaland as Secretary of Interior is seen as such a step forward in terms of the federal government's responsibility to tribes than we've ever had before. We hope that from the top down, we can affect local and regional change that's in big opposition to not only sovereignty, but for instance, tribal buffalo restoration efforts. The trust responsibility also lies with the states and local agencies. And oftentimes those state and local agencies, tribes aren't even written into the Constitution, let alone a formal consultation process and what that looks like to implement policies and good laws for not only the state, but allowing the tribe to do the same for our own people, recognizing that sovereignty, not undermining the jurisdiction of the tribes on fee lands or lands that are under question within existing reservation boundaries. There's a it's a complex issue, and we hope that through, I think that there's an effort amongst conservation organizations today to diligently work to support sovereignty of tribes and the self-determination of those tribes, because in terms of conservation, they overlap so well. It's just that many of these conservation organizations don't know how to provide that meaningful consultation and to provide the voice for tribes on these conservation issues on reservation as well as off. So what I see happening is many of these organizations are seeing the benefit of hiring tribal members to tell the story. And that is a step in the right direction, and empowering those people to carry that message and to be a voice for some of the community. But it's really important to also involve that whole community and ensure that meaningful understanding is happening amongst all involved.
Thanks, Jason. Yufna, let's go to you. Can you give us some history on the Northern Arapaho people and how they came to the Wind River Indian Reservation?
Sure. I just wanted to say first that everything Jason said was just awesome. It really puts a background support story to everything that we're doing, and I really liked his words. So as far as the Arapahoe history, I just wanted to share really quick. I did a presentation recently about the Red Desert. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, and so I just wanted to go into how we became a part of what used to be the Eastern Shoshone Reservation. A lot of the Arapahoe history goes back far into, us migrating from the Great Lakes into Kansas and Colorado, Nebraska. A lot of our history, we were migratory. We followed the subsistence strategies of, the buffalo, the plants, the animals. So looking at this history and kind of hitting upon what Jason was talking about, I think that was what he said was really great. You got to look at treaties. You want to talk about how we became a part of the Wind River Reservation. This is kind of the timeline of that. And so it goes from 1851, 1864, 1866, 1868, 1870, where we were just, at the Arapahoe, basically the Thunder Basin. And we were a lot of the times with Red Cloud. And at that time, they were calling it Red Cloud's War, all these little Indian battles and wars. The Arapahoe, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota were really closely related in their leadership. My great-grandfather, who is sharp-nosed, who is sitting next to Touch the Clouds in this picture, basically, they had this alliance. They were working together. They were the last chiefs to see themselves as just migrating the land. And slowly, we were corralled into all of these Indian wars. You guys stop. And so one of the things we did was really moving forward and talking about how can we have our own reservation. So it came back after Custer's Last Stand in 1876, they really talked about how do we get the Arapahoes, how do we get these tribes to quit? They're raising all this ruckus in the West. How do we make them quit? We need to settle them on reservations, whether it's forced. So in 1877, these delegates at the bottom in this photo here was a delegation of Arapaho and Lakota who went to DC, and they requested that the Arapahoes receive their own reservations. Every one of the tribes wanted their own reservation. And in 1878, in a way I see it, looking back on it, I think that a lot of the times, if you look at our history, we were in Colorado, and once there was gold found there, it was basically like, okay, let's get these indigenous people off the land so we can have those resources for ourselves. And then how do we get them to relinquish that land? Well, later on, it became that, well, we need to pay for our part of the reservation. And so after we settled in 1878, a lot of historical oral histories, knowledge had been that, okay, the Arapahoes are going to have to be here. And it was always the Arapaho idea and the chief's idea that at some point we were supposed to be just temporarily placed here and we were supposed to receive our own reservation. And I think it's over 100 and something years now. And after basically realizing that we settled the Colorado settlement and selling our lands there, we really, the government was like, well, you really don't have no place to go now. So within that history, a lot of turmoil, a lot of different ideas are being thrown around. And so after all of these years, we are here with the Eastern Shoshone on the Wind River Reservation. That is the history of the Arapaho and how we've come to this reservation. I think really talking about that you won't find that in books. You won't find that in lecture, you won't find that you'll if you look for it on the web, you're really going to have to dig deep. And a lot of what Jason said earlier is true. We're here to tell that story, the accurate story of like how our history was. And like Jason said, you're not going to sit in class and hear about this because a lot of the time they don't tell that part of the history. I hope some summarizes all of it.
Yeah, thanks to you both for summarizing thousands of years of history in 10 minutes. Pretty tough thing to do. I know we're skimming over a lot, but I think it's important that we touch on the difference between a constitution and an IRA tribe. And Yufna, I'd like you to take a shot at that and give some of that background to the participants and journalists here so they understand the type of government that exists on the Wind River Indian Reservation.
Okay, great. Yeah, so one of the things is the Indian Reorganization Act. Basically, Indian removal policy had started back in the early 1900s. And what the tribes and the government were trying to do was settle tribes on the reservation. And right now they're talking about how, a lot of the times we're talking about how did tribes relinquish their title to the land? How does a lot of those issues come into play? A lot of the times non-natives don't realize that during these times before we were settled onto reservations, we did have our own traditional governments. We had our own traditional structure and we had our own hierarchy, and it varied dependent upon tribes and how they were structured. So with that in our traditional ideas of governance, self-governance, when the Indian reorganization had happened, basically the War Department had came in, the superintendent had came to the tribes and said, how are you guys going to organize yourselves politically? And the tribes were like, well, we have our traditional government. And they were like, well, you either become an IRA tribe, Indian Reorganization Act tribe with a constitution, or you become a non-IRA tribe. And at that time, the Arapahoes were going to put it to a vote and we're going to decide. And for us, we decided that we would not become an IRA tribe that we would sustain our traditional governance, which was right now, we don't have a constitution. Other tribes do have constitutions, which fit under, with the state, under the federal government, and within those constitutions, their bylaws and districts within their reservation basically are their standing orders and how they're going to run and structure their government, their tribes. For us, it's not so much. We do not have a constitution, and we have tribal resolutions. Those tribal resolutions are our standing orders and how we're going to run our government. And we do have a tribal code that we follow, and then we move forward and we govern ourselves through tribal court and through federal law still. And through that, with no constitution, a tribal constitution, a lot of the tribes I've seen in other places when I've done any other projects or work, there's pros and cons to having a constitution, a tribal constitution, and there's pros and cons to having a tribal resolutions. So a lot of the time, a lot of the resolutions that we pass as the tribe is basically word by word how we're going to run a certain project, a certain issue. That tribal resolution is going to have language in there, and it's going to say how something should go. So I'm hoping that kind of helps clarify all of that, but maybe Jason might want to add to that if he would like.
Jason, anything to add?
No, I think that's great. I totally agree that there's pros and cons to IRA governments, but there's more knowledgeable folks out there about the history of our IRA and how we implement codes and govern ourselves. And I think that is an important history to know and understand. The law and order code, the Wind River water code, our game code. These are very important laws that were implemented as governments to ensure the protection and management of our resources. And if we don't have these codes in place, then it makes it much easier for private entities, corporate interests, oil and gas folks, more of the takers. It makes it easier for them to continue to take from us. And so I really feel that the codes need to be well understood, and we need to likely implement some more codes so that we can ensure that not only no more lands are lost to these opposing paradigms, that we can continue to grow cultural revitalization efforts, language preservation, access traditional foods and traditional territories. And I think in order to do that, codes will ensure that not only our lands are protected, but increased, so that we have a greater ability to ensure that our young kids and our youth are more knowledgeable about their history and cultural values that make us unique as caretakers and stewards of the land and its resources, or as we would say, our relatives. So that's all I would add.
Thanks, Jason. Could you lead us into a discussion on how the government on the Wind River Indian Reservation works as far as the business councils and the general councils? I think that's something folks typically are confused about, and also how this IRA piece placates into that.
Yeah, so the two tribes, the Eastern Shoshone and the Northern Arapaho, operate as separate tribal governments. They have elected representatives, 6 elected representatives of each government that are selected by the General Council. And the General Council is the governing body of the government. And that is the membership, those over 18 years old that are enrolled members of each tribe. So General council meetings are held for each tribe independently to create laws and policies. And these are resolution based oftentimes, and they guide the direction of the elected business council. And in the early days, a joint business council was established as a means to oversee jointly held resources, because after 1924, the Northern Arapaho became part owners of the reservation. The change from the Shoshone Reservation to the Wind River Reservation. And the Joint Business Council was a means to govern with the leadership of both elected representative councils. That was in existence for decades up until 2014, and the Joint Business Council was dissolved. There were a lot of implications to that. There were several agency type organizations set up, one of which was the Wind River Environmental Quality Commission, very important entity to oversee water quality, implement air quality standards. There was a Brownsfields program to clean up abandoned oil and gas wells. Several programs under this entity that was part of the dual governed agency. There were several others that went under in 2014, and only a couple remain. One of them is the Office of the Tribal Water Engineer. The board is membership of both tribes. It's a organization that held on. Since 2014, we've had elected leadership that works on an intergovernmental council, essentially for the same functions that the Joint Business Council had with a different name. Many of the programs that existed before haven't been brought back yet, but are duly needed. And so there's a lot of division that exists, not only within the two tribes governmentally. There's also division within tribes themselves. And so it becomes very difficult oftentimes to not only elect a leadership that's knowledgeable culturally, but also environmentally or conservation oriented. And with leadership that changes every 2 years, it oftentimes makes policies hard to implement and sustain. And so it's very important that, the cultural understanding exists, because the two tribes are speak two different languages, are culturally different, and that creates challenges in terms of implementing laws and policies and codes for the benefit of all of our tribal members and communities. So oftentimes people come in not understanding that there is two tribes, that there is two tribal governments, that we're non-IRA, that we have codes, we have our own laws, and we have our own challenges, but many, many opportunities, I believe, to work in the right direction together, collaboratively, for the benefit of all people and the plants and the animals and the land that we in places share together, especially off reservation. And access to some of these places is very important for ancestral foods. Being able to go out and harvest medicines and plants at certain times of the year, and make sure that state and local agencies recognize those rights that exist by treaty, and should be more understood and respected.
Thank you, Jason and Yufna. I definitely want to save a chunk of time at the end of this session for questions, but I wanted to move us along to understand how both both tribes have tribal historic preservation offices, and how do they interact on behalf of the tribe's interest? And Yufna, why don't you start with that?
Sure. So under the National Historic Preservation Act, there are state historic preservation officers and there are tribal historic preservation officers. THPO stands for Tribal Historic Preservation Office or Officer. What that person does is they regulate within their tribal boundaries, which could be within the reservation and ancestral territory that they claim. And they claim any cultural resource type of management that may need federal undertakings. Federal undertaking is anything under NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act. And under NEPA, a lot of federal agencies have to go and they have to consult with tribes. But basically kind of going back on that, what Jason had said was how a lot of the times it's glossed over. A lot of agencies will see it and just as a checking the box kind of thing off and moving forward, and tribes aren't really negotiating at 100% through consultation government to government when it comes to any type of those types of things. That's what the Tribal Historic Preservation Office has to deal with. And sometimes it may vary with other tribes, they're elected, like elected officials. With other tribes, it's a employment position that is applied for. And I was the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for nearly 13, 14 years. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to do for one tribe. And trying to collaborate and negotiate with other Tribal Historic Preservation Officers is really important because a lot of the time, ancestral territory does overlap. I don't know if Jason wants to add to that, but basically that, for me, that's what it kind of is.
Thanks, Yufna. I think that's very, very important, and very glad that you were able to serve in that capacity as a THPO officer and bring that knowledge to the reservation and the importance of many of these places that may be off reservation, maybe on, that contain the blood and bones and the contents of our people's communities. And so to have a tribal voice at many of these archaeological digs, roads that are being built that uncover bones or rivers that wash out beds of bones. These are places that have significant cultural value to tribes. And it's very important that the THPO offices and the officers are involved in not only the efforts of the past, but also our contemporary efforts moving forward. Buffalo restoration, for instance. Very important that our THPO officers are on the same page as we build the cultural relationship and connection again with Buffalo. As cultural preservation officers, it is by their namesake to do best in ensuring that our cultural values are restored, preserved, and even encouraged amongst our young people. We have to restore and build that connection, cultural connection that we have to Buffalo, our land, the fish, the water, all these components, again, in order to be part of our healing is connected to all of those. And so it's very important that our THPOs are included on many of these conversations, especially in areas that overlap.
Thank you. This next question is that I have for you all is to really do your best to explain in a few moments any important intertribal dynamics that journalists and media should know that exist between the Arapaho and the Eastern Shoshone people. I know, Jason, that you said that they come from completely different cultures. They have different practices, different ceremonies, and a completely different language. What can you tell us as far as how that plays out with interacting with the media and each other?
Bringing out the tough questions. That's a difficult one, because oftentimes the intertribal dynamics are what makes it most difficult for us to move forward and to heal from the past. And this happens, as a tactic, I think, of the federal government to put enemy tribes together in the hopes we'd kill each other off. And I really do believe that this isn't the only case of where that happened. For the most part today, our young people have family members that are members of both tribes. I have sisters that are enrolled Arapaho. Both of my parents are enrolled Shoshone, and that relationship that happens within our families and communities is strong for some and weak for others. And oftentimes we ourselves bring each other down. And it's in every community that's been oppressed, has undergone genocidal practices and has nearly lost many of the cultural aspects. It was outlawed to practice ceremonies until 1978 with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. I was born in 78. And so I can really relate to, the lack of connection maybe that many have to those cultural aspects. And thankfully, fortunately, we were able to hold on to those belief systems and ceremonial practices and belief ways that encourage and teach us of our connection to this place and each other, and how we treat one another, to how we live our lives every day, to what we do, how we carry ourselves. All of these things are part of the healing that has to happen in many communities across Indian country. And so the intertribal dynamics is very difficult. It's hard to see, it's hard to witness, it's hard to take part in that. But we take part in that every day. My wife is Arapaho. Many of our community members are members of both tribes. And it's very difficult to maintain, two separate governments when our young people have connections to both tribes. It's very divisionary, because there's Yufna can speak to this as well, but it's hard to understand unless you live it and you're part of it. Just know that it exists. Really, to understand that history is really what gives you the foundational understanding to know why things are the way they are now. And understanding that past and that history kind of helps. If you don't know that, then it's easy to judge. And there's a lot of misinterpretations. There's a lot of misconceptions about tribes and individual tribes, and I'm sure that makes that very difficult in terms of journalism, because you have to have an in-depth understanding of that history. That means you've got to step out of your comfort zone to do a little more research. Maybe you have to go to a powwow. Maybe you have to attend go onto the reservation and visit with folks. You have to break down some of these barriers as a journalist, to step outside of your comfort zone to learn and understand a different perspective or way of looking at the world. And I would encourage you to do that, because Native people aren't going to go to you. You're going to have to step out of your comfort zone and put yourself in places that may feel uncomfortable, may be different than anything you've ever known, but it's going to cause cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance occurs when you travel to another country, you go to another culture, and you submerge yourself in that, and you have a realization within yourself about something you never knew before. That's cognitive dissonance. That happens when you place yourself in somewhere other than what you know. And I encourage anybody and everybody to experience that, because it changes your outlook, changes your worldview. And that's very important in understanding other people.
Thank you, Jason. Yufna, do you have anything to add to the intertribal dynamics between the Northern Shoshone and Eastern, or excuse me, the Northern Arapaho and Eastern Shoshone?
Honestly, what Jason had just described right now was really great. I would just add that, you know, as journalists, it's always just like he said at the end, it's the journalists that I've seen a lot of people write about the Wind River Reservation. They don't realize the dynamics that are here, the good things that are here. And it's always that microscope looking from the outside inward. And it's hard to tell those stories of tribes here when that research and that being a part of the community isn't that story that's being told from here. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've kind of decided to do this, was that, you know, so many times we read stories about the tribes that need to be accurate, that need to be really from that perspective of, you know, telling that accurate story, but also including the good things of, you know, what we do together and how we do that and how we move forward, how we've survived this long, you know, and a lot of that needs to be told. I like what Jason said, and I have nothing else to add but that. Thanks.
Thank you both. We have some questions coming in now, and if anybody has more questions, please use the Q&A function. One of our participants has asked, what roles have the TIPO offices played in endangered species decisions recently, specifically with wolves, grizzly bears, etc.? And what role do you think they should be playing? Yufna, why don't you go ahead and answer that first?
So when I was the TIPO, we did deal with the grizzly bear in the state. We did talk about the wolf. It's always about the wolf introduction or the wolf something. The other one is the sage grouse. The sage grouse was huge. I would get all these huge boxes full of sage grouse documentation and paperwork. As far as endangered species, as far as any of that, from a tribal perspective, a lot of that is endangered. When we look at it and we realize that it's so precious that we need to mitigate and put in comments and decide that, hey, this, not just the animals, but the plants are important to us as tribal people. I wish other people would realize that it shouldn't have to get to the point where things are endangered that we have to do something about it. We can do things about so many different issues right now. It shouldn't never get to the point where it's endangered. But management is another thing. When you talk about management for how the TIPOs manage a lot of the land goes back to jurisdiction. Various federal agencies also do their process in comments and repatriations. They have their own various protocols that they have to follow. So being the TIPO, you kind of have to know a lot of that internal processing for each forestry, you know, game and fish. Everybody has their own way of being able to process endangered species or plants. But a lot of the time, one of the things is being able to move forward in a way that's beneficial, not just to us, but the environment. So as far as that goes, I don't know if I'm answering that correctly, but there's a lot of work that goes into it.
Jason, anything to add?
I would just add that, you know, the federal government has trust responsibility to tribes to make management recommendations on fish and wildlife, including endangered species. So it'd be my hope that those federal field offices are cooperating or coordinating with the TIPOs to ensure that the tribal voice is included in those management recommendations. there's very few field offices that exist today, but my dad is a retired fish and wildlife biologist. He was in a unique position as a federal employee, as well as a tribal member working on wildlife regulations and protection of fisheries on the Wind River Reservation. And there were supposed to be 8 or 9 of these field offices, and there were in the beginning of the 70s and 80s. These field offices were set up as field offices to uphold the trust responsibility to the federal government to tribes in the management of fish and wildlife. There was in the field office at Flathead in Montana, near Crow and Northern Cheyenne, down in Utah with the Ute and Ouray, and down with the Southern Ute. There was one here next door to the Wind River Reservation where my dad was project leader. The only field office that exists today is the Lander Field Office. And the only office that really worked and did due diligence to implement fish and wildlife programs was this office. And the result is what we see today. We manage 6 of the 7 ungulate species as wildlife, such that our tribal members have access to traditional foods through meat that many tribes don't have. We have world-class fisheries above the major diversions for ag, but we were the very first to establish a wilderness roadless area 26 years before the Federal Wilderness Act that designated a 180,000 acre wilderness area that contains over 200 lakes, several hundred miles of rivers and streams. So the habitat is here. And luckily, the federal government, through the work of my dad, lived up to its federal trust responsibility in the management of fisheries and wildlife. It also caused great contention. The longest running court case in the history of Wyoming is the Bighorn case. And that's over who controls water on the reservation. Because the state essentially decided that the reservation was created for agriculture, and the tribe's implementation of in-stream flow to protect fishery wasn't considered a beneficial use of water. Therefore, depleting the Wind River by 100% for ag is seen as okay. At the same time, we're irrigating alfalfa and sugar beet and high water use crops in a high elevation desert from a water system that's fed with 30 to 40% glacial flows that we predict will be gone in 50 years. So what's happening here with water and the argument over water versus agriculture and ecological integrity? Well, where does traditional ecological knowledge fall? It's going to be for a holistic approach to management of our water and our wildlife species. If we manage for biodiversity, then we're improving not only the land, but we're improving ourselves, because that gives us access again to the pharmacy and the grocery store that grows around us, and makes it very difficult to think about the paradigm shift, the paradigm change that happens on systems that were imposed upon us, but now in an effort in self-determination and cultural revitalization, we can return to some of these belief systems and access to foods and medicines and animals that are critical to the health of our communities.
Thank you, both Jason and Yufna. We're going to start our break here pretty shortly, but before I do that, I want to review the answers to the poll that I just closed, and talk about some of the resources that you were shared earlier. So these questions were really, and the data came from a report produced by the Native American Journalists Association in 2020. So the news source that dedicated the most news when this study took place was actually The Guardian. And the answer to number 2, if you look at your bingo card, you see there's a number of used in media. And according to that study, poverty, reservation, drugs, addiction, alcohol, and drums were the most used words and stigmatized themes in media. And number three, what news source best sources its information from sources within Indigenous communities? That is NPR. For every 3 stories that they produce, 2 of them have been insourced from people actually living within Indigenous communities. So without further ado, we're going to take a short break. Don't leave. I'm not going to end the webinar. I'm just going to mute myself, stop video so the panelists can take a short break, and we will resume in 5 or so minutes. All right, everybody, I'm going to launch the second poll and give you all a couple of minutes to answer this while we begin. And while folks are answering that and we're coming back, I'm going to talk about some resources that I have found to be super helpful in this topic. First of all, the Native American Journalists Association has a bunch of resources, many which we included in our resource packet to you all. We also created a media guide of our own for the tribes on the Wind River Reservation. And there's some important contact information as far as public relation contacts go, and other information about general counsel, TIPO offices, and that sort of thing. The Tribal Nations Media Guide looks like this from the Native American Journalists Association. It has a series of questions that they suggest journalists answer before writing a story that takes place on an Indigenous community or related to Indigenous issues. And of course, it's a good idea to avoid these stereotypical themes that are overused. So with that, I'll give you 30 seconds to answer the poll. I see a few more folks are answering that. And I don't know if I mentioned this book. This book can be found at the Eastern Shoshone Cultural Center on the reservation, and it's called Tribal Government, Wind River Reservation, and it's by Janet Flynn. This has been such a great resource for me. It's about 80, 90 pages, and it's really concise, and it goes through the governmental history on the reservation as far as the councils not becoming a constitutional tribe or adopting a constitutional government, and other really important information. So I encourage you to pick this up. And the next part of our program, Jason and Yufna are going to be answering more specific questions in regards to reporter guidelines, how to talk about individual or how to speak to the tribes, whether you're talking to an individual or the entire tribe, and who to look to. So that's what we're going to be getting into next. And again, I want to remind folks, if you're interested in going on a tour with Jason and Yufna on Friday, we have several open spots. You know, I think I'm going to leave this poll open until the end because we only have about 19 of us that have responded. So I'm going to keep that open and I'll respond to that later. All right, let's dive in. So let's, I'll open this to Yufna. What are some cultural norms of the tribes, or at least the Northern Arapaho, that you can speak to that is relevant to journalism? And I know that's pretty general, but if you could talk about things such as speaking to an individual or the entire tribe, or in the importance of elders in your response, that would be great.
As far as asking the tribe to comment on anything, if it's huge, you need to remember to go to the tribal council. You need to make sure, if you want an official comment, you need to make sure you go to the tribal council, and it could be any tribal council. If it's an official comment you want, make sure you're, asking for their comments. Tribal members, you can interview them, you can talk to them, get their perspective on things, but really in the end, if you want the official comment, it has to come from the tribal officials, the leaders. They're the ones that are going to have the last say on anything. So make sure you reach out to them, make sure you're engaging with them, and make sure that you're having their contact information. Kind of let them know ahead of time how to how to contact them, who to engage with, who can speak on their behalf. Also, just making sure that, you know, it's not a one-time thing, because if you're always writing about the reservation or a reservation, make sure you're always reaching out. So they kind of know who you are, even if you might move to a different place, be like, hey, you know, I did write this story in the past, you know, I am with somebody else, a different organization, and this is what I'd like to write about. So they kind of know, kind of having credibility, I guess, kind of knowing the types of stories you're writing, that they want to know. And then just making sure that if you're interviewing anybody, reciprocity is big. Reciprocity is huge for tribes. They're not, you know, we have the value of reciprocity. So if you're giving them a gift in exchange for a story, if they're somewhere and they're praying, do not take pictures. They'll have signs up, or they'll have security if it's some type of event that's going on that they don't want pictures taken. They'll let you know ahead of time. Make sure you ask all the time, even if it's children or elders, is it okay that I take your picture? And just making sure that you're making those connections. Like I said, gift giving is huge, especially for elders. You know, if you're going to ask them for a story, ask them, you know, reciprocity, why, like, you know, maybe I'll take your picture and I'll send you copies after we're done, or you do an interview and then you send that interview with the story back to them. You know, that's really great. That's something they'll cherish, you know. And then the other thing is just making sure that, you know, again, making sure that if it's the tribal council making a comment, or if it's a tribal member, make sure you're putting that on there and using their names, their official names. If it's the chairman, write the chairman, the tribal chairman. If it's a tribal member, make sure you write it's a tribal member. And being really specific and accurate is where we're going with this, making sure that, you know, I think one of the other things was saying that if you see someone and they may have be dressed for the part, they might not be the person you want to interview, but hey, maybe they might want to take a picture. Is it okay that you take a picture? The other thing is, just making sure that you're making those connections, you're engaging, reciprocity is happening, and just being really respectful of this type of stories, the type of information you're putting out, making sure it's accurate. A lot of the times, tribes will write things and it's like, well, you'll read it, you'll come back and read it and it won't make no sense. You'll be like, what is going on here? Who's actually going on? So just being really accurate in that is really important.
Thanks, Yufna. Can you talk about the importance of elders in your culture? And yeah.
Okay, yes. So for elders, they're the highest of our hierarchy. You know, whether it's a ceremonial elder or an elder of our tribe, they're the ones that carry our knowledge. They're the ones that we show reverence to, or they're the ones that we basically help to do everything because they have this knowledge, right? And if they share that knowledge with you, it's really important. And so the way you show that respect back to them is by giving them something small, possibly food, possibly something. There's times we've done things where somebody will give jam, small gifts of tobacco, small gifts of baskets, a food basket, bread, meats, whatever. They love getting anything that they could take home and actually use. So with elders, they're really special to us. We respect them with the most, you know, we respect them the most, but at the same time, if you're going to ask them for a story, if they're there with their families, be like, hey, could I ask the elder to do a story? If you're looking out to do a story with an elder, and you do contact the whether it's the TIPO office or the tribal council, ask them, do you have elders we can talk to? Do you have their contact information? Most of the time they do, because they work with them themselves. So just having that ahead of time, kind of knowing that ahead of time is really helpful. And being able to tell that accurate story really goes back to what they value, how they'll tell that story and they'll share it. So that's really important too.
Thanks, Yufna. I'm gonna keep you on the spot because Jason is having technical difficulties. Are
That's
there
fine.
any existing tribal superstition or taboos or cultural taboos that we should be aware of before approaching the Northern Arapaho people that you can share?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of the times I actually do a training with my own tribal workers of things that we do and don't do. But a lot of it is, just a lot of internal things that tribes believe internally. And it may vary within, coastal tribes, high plain tribes, Pueblo tribes, depending on their values and their superstitions. There are things that you should do and you should not do. And so a lot of the times, one that I've seen a lot on social media is the photos of human remains. That's a huge do not do. And also the other part to that is actually against the law to share human remains. And you can get into a lot of trouble if you share human remains, even if you found them, even if they're discovery, because it can come back to be a possible crime scene. And so a lot of the time, be really thoughtful about the photos you share and how you share them. And not just human remains. It could be, even of a tooth, even of something that may have come from a person. You have to be really careful about sharing. And also just really being able to think of outside the box of like, is this appropriate? Is this something the tribe would be proud to see on front of the newspaper? Really getting into that because, and if you don't know, call someone, call the tribe, call anybody and be like, you think it's okay to share this photo? That's why it's important to ask ahead of time, is it okay if we take photos at an event? Sometimes you'll find pictures of people taking pictures or video of somebody praying or doing a ceremony, and always get authorization ahead of time because the person praying may not want that shared, and always just be diligent about that. Superstitious wise, I think again, like it varies what images you share, what imagery you do share, and how you share it is also important. Other than, what tribes feel like should not be shared are like of ceremony, like I said, praying, people fasting, people sharing that ceremony with themselves. If they invited you to be there, just be there as that, in that experience. You don't need to take pictures and, if you're going to write about it later, make sure that you're getting authorization to do that also. And it really just goes back to, I think tribes have been appropriated so much in the past that, and we've had to hide it for so long, like kind of what Jason was talking about, we had to put our ceremonies and stuff underground for so long. We're lucky to still have them today. And so just really being able to engage with tribes in a way that's positive is where we're kind of going with this. Not every tribe is the same. Everybody speaks their own language. Everybody believes in different things. So reach out to them and ask them, is this okay? Is this not okay? And they'll let you know. They'll talk.
Thanks, Yufna. I'm gonna kind of engage the participants here to ask you questions. Everybody, this is your time to really pick Yufna's brain about any cultural questions that you have. And this is a very safe space. We're here to learn. I also want to let you know Jason's having 22 students have just showed up on the Buffalo Ranch, and he may or may not be joining us for the remainder of the program. But please type your questions in the Q&A box and please respond to the poll. I have a question for you, Yufna. I know that one of the important ceremonies of the Northern Arapaho people is the Sundance. And I've read that it was, it was illegal for people to practice that ceremony. I wonder if you could touch on the significance of that ceremony to people and some of the history and context behind it and when it will be occurring.
What was the last part?
When it takes place and the significance around it as far as like celestial events in the universe.
Okay, so one thing with the Sundance with all other tribes who do practice it is a lot of the time it's not covered. It's something that is so wholly sacred to the tribes that practice it that a lot of the time they'll have their own security and they'll ask that no pictures be taken. You can't even go and draw a picture and sit there and draw a picture. They'll take that away from you. So it's really strict based upon the fact that, you know, the participants who are there are basically, you know, are going through this ceremony, who are suffering, who don't want to be on the front page of a newspaper, right? So a lot of the times, people in a ceremony will say, hey, you know, it's okay that you're here, but maybe not take no pictures and don't write no story. But the history of it has been that, you know, tribes, High Plain tribes and other tribes have practiced it for so long, and it had to go underground a while ago because of the basic forced assimilation, genocide of the tribes. And a lot of the time, if you were found practicing it, you weren't converting to Catholicism or whatever religion they had at that time, you were punished. You could be punished severely. You could be put in jail. Your rations could be taken away from you. If you had a job, you know, you couldn't really go to it if you're in jail. So the punishment for practicing a lot of that was really harsh. And so tribes today hold that so sacredly and respectfully that when we practice it today, it's kind of like, you know, really so important that we don't want it to be appropriated. And a lot of the times it is. I really feel like a lot of the times, a lot of what tribes had ceremonially had to go underground. And even today, it's hard to bring them back because nobody wants to get in trouble. Nobody wants to get in trouble for practicing it or talking about it. A lot of our own women's ceremonies have been kind of just underground for a very long time too. So being able to come and bring it back out, practice it, be proud of it is really a part of that cultural identity. And to be a part of that is huge. When you're part of a community that can continuously pass that on is important also.
Thanks, Yufna. That's super interesting. And is the ceremony starting soon? When does it take place?
It basically every summer, every solstice, and it changes. The dates change depending upon, you know, resources, and think about all of the people that have to put into it to put it up and to be a part of that. I mean, it takes a lot of energy, but time, resources, people. So it just depends on what time of the year, and it's usually mostly when it's really hot.
All right, I have a question from one of the participants asking you to explain when to refer to people as a tribal citizen versus a descendant versus a tribal member.
So a lot of tribes right now are dealing with the issue of enrollment. As you may know, or you may not, a lot of tribes had to, are based upon pedigree. You know, what other person in the nation has to show their equivalent fractionated number of blood degree, blood quantum. So it really boils back down to who's a descendant, who's a tribal member. And if you're enrolled as a federally recognized tribe, through a federally recognized tribe, you're considered an enrolled tribal member. Most tribes right now are changing the language to say that if you're a part of a tribe, you're a citizen. So when you do ask and you do talk to a tribe, ask them, because it varies for various tribes. I've seen other tribes just call it in citizens. I'm a citizen of the something nation. So it just really boils down to enrollment, blood quantum, which I think is pretty crazy. We're the only people that have to prove blood quantum in the United States and actually carry a federally recognized card and show it, which is kind of different and interesting. But one of the things is what that does is supposedly under treaties, we have treaty obligations of education, healthcare. And if you go to a healthcare facility, like for myself, I could go to Oklahoma and show my federal ID and then be seen at the Indian clinic there. Opposed to other tribes, they'll be like, just, and this varies just depending on where you're enrolled and what type of benefits you get. So that's what it supposedly comes back to. When you talk about treaties and treaty obligations, it's really important to know what your treaties are. And there's so much we could talk about treaties too. But in the end, that's what it boils down to, is blood quantum treaties, treaty obligations, and proving your descendancy. Talking about descendancy, if you have grandparents or parents who are actually enrolled, certified, and then you cannot enroll yourself, then you're considered a descendant. You may not have enough blood quantum to fit into being enrolled. And so that brings a lot of internal issues too.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on this a bit, but I have another question from a participant who said he recently read a story about the Chinook Indian Nation, a tribe that has not been federally recognized. And it made him wonder about the sensitivities about asking tribal affiliation. So how should journalists or non-native folks take into consideration things like enrollment and federal recognition and other specifics when asking about somebody's Indigenous identity?
I think that's really important. Indigenous identity today is a part of two paradigms for me. It's erasure, and then it's citizenship or enrollment. And there's nothing that ever just goes straight down the line of like, kind of what they're asking is basically, if you're wanting to do a story about the Chinook, I would say ask the tribal members, ask the elders, what would you rather be, if they want to be a part of the story first, and then how do they want to be spoken about. So a lot of the times people will say for the Dene, the Navajo, that's what they want to be called, is Dene. For the Arapaho, we call ourselves the Arapaho, but a lot of the time people are starting to use Hinanae. Hinanae is Arapaho. And so maybe the Chinook, if they write this story, maybe they may want to use their traditional name. So take that into consideration also. And as you go and you write these stories about the tribes, it's okay to ask them ahead of time, would you rather want me to write this story about you as a citizen, or as a citizen of the Chinook, or a citizen of whatever they may be called as traditional names? So it's really good to go ahead and have that conversations with them. A lot of the time, various tribes vary when it comes to be written a story about, like, that person's an enrolled member of the Northern Arapaho tribe, right? Or that person is enrolled with the Hanana'i, or whatever it is. Make sure you're asking them, and that make sure it's accurate. I hope that helps, but a lot of the time it's really great to just ask them themselves. Other tribes vary, and they may want to be identified as something else.
Well, I'm going to ask you, Yufna, would you be preferred to be called a Northern Arapaho citizen, member, or descendant?
I like citizen, even though, because I do know that I am enrolled. I don't need to, just in a way, I feel like I need to be humble about it and not be like, oh yeah, I'm an enrolled member, because a lot of the times we have members who are not don't have the ability to be enrolled. We have family who are like at that point of like, okay, do we have enough blood quantum, to fit into this little notch that the federal government has So a lot of the time it's great to just say, hey, I am a part of the Northern Arapaho. So I like citizen. I forgot what tribe has come up with that term, but they've actually put it in as their enrollment process, and that they consider all their tribal members, people, even descendants, as citizens. So I really like that term.
Thank you. We're getting lots of questions from the audience and a lot of thank yous to you, Yufna, for answering these. I have one here about ceremonies in the Red Desert, and I want you to answer this to the best of your ability or what you feel comfortable with here, Yufna. Do ceremonies still take place in the Red Desert? And I wish Jason were here to speak to that too, but from what you know.
I too wish Jason was here. Maybe there's some perspective he could lend, but I think that a lot of times tribes currently and since time immemorial have always used these sacred spaces. And it's not this big drawn out celebratory event that you might think happens with tribes. For a lot of the time, it's times where tribes may want to go back to these places and show reverence, and they're not gonna publicly tell people like, hey, I'm gonna go make this flyer and this poster, and I want everybody to be there. It's more sacred. Our spirituality is more closed off to how we practice it. And I honestly feel like, and not just the Red Desert, but everywhere else, we see it as our sacred place. I had a grandpa who would say, every time I step out the door, that's my church. Every time I go step out the door of the car, that's my church. Because what he was relating to was that the environment was his church. He didn't need to be inside to pray. Anytime he needed to pray, he would step outside. And the holistic sacred part of that is the birds, the birds singing, the plants being there, the smells, the aroma, the sounds are what brought him back to being like, I am a part of this land. The Red Desert in its own way does the same for very many tribes. And I think that it is still being used today. You just won't see it outwardly, publicly told like, hey, we're using this site. It's up to tribes to decide when they want to go and they want to pray, and however way they want to use it is up to them. And I think they should be regarded and given that ability to be able to pray whenever they want. And it shouldn't be that we should always have to figure out, okay, how are we going to get them to come pray at this time? Can the tourists be here or can they not? And so a lot of the times that's what tribes have to deal with when they do want to go use their sacred places.
Thanks, Yufna. And while I won't divulge any details, I can say that a friend of mine who is Eastern Shoshone, they was in the Red Desert 3 weeks ago for a ceremony. Let's move on to more specifics about best practices for language. And Yufna, I know that different tribes have different languages and also different imagery and symbols that have meaning to their people, such as animals as messengers or certain places. And I'm wondering if you can share any specifics that in regards to the Northern Arapaho people that is important for us when reporting on these issues.
So a lot of the times, if I were to do a story with somebody, I would tell them ahead of time, like, what is your story about? And then they would say, wolf introductory or anything of that type of nature. And being culturally sensitive is really important because it's not just about being accurate, but it's about being respectful of what tribes want to share. And in a way that's accurate, but at the same time being able to share various images and designs and songs and dances is really important. With tribes, if you're going to a public place and they are dancing, ask them ahead of time to take their picture, but that those pictures are more than welcome to be shared. That video is more than welcome to be shared if the tribal members that you are videotaping approve. And then just imagery. I know that not for, well, in a way, kind of for my tribe and not for my tribe, but the image of an owl, a lot of the times people don't want to see that, because to us, that's the image of, we're told that the owl is a messenger of death. And so it's not something you want to, you know, put on the front page of a newspaper and be like, hey, you know, and have that owl right there. Even if you are doing a story about an owl, maybe figure out if it's directly towards tribes, maybe figure out some other way to show that imagery. And just again, a lot of, you know, buffalo, and I kind of wish Jason was here, because a lot of the buffalo, we really hold that sacred also. But how we take pictures and put a spin to the pictures and the photos is really important. How we want to promote those, marketing it and showing how tribes are moving forward with the buffalo is really also important. But just being really respectful, just really knowing ahead of time that certain images probably don't want to be shared. I'll share one example, and it was of a lady who had a completely beaded top with indigenous geometric designs, and somebody copied the designs on her dress and they marketed it. They made hoodies and put her design on there. And every time you see a tribal person with a design on themselves or certain colors that they dance with, is sacred and important to them. They earn those colors, they earn those designs from their relatives, that it's a personal thing to them. So when somebody shares that information, it could just be an image and somebody sees it and they're like, oh, I want to share that. It's going to be mine. So I'm going to market it and put it out for sale. So I've seen many instances where that's happened. And just be really mindful of what you put out in social media. Be mindful and respectful what you put in the newspapers, because other people will see that and they'll be like, oh, that's what the tribe wanted to share, and that's something I'll take upon myself to make things out of. So just being respectful of that's also important.
Thank you. There is a really good question that came in, and it's directed at you, Yufna. And they want to know what you think about when journalists come to Wyoming and the community interested in covering the reservation and the tribe accurately, but has never lived in the state or region, and they have limited knowledge about the reservation. And how and what do you think this journalist should do and take steps to better report on the reservation and learn as they go along? And if there are any resources or people that they should first approach and contact, or any groups and or communities they should be a part of?
Nice. Yes, that's a really good question. I'm glad they're asking, because it's really important, like I said at the beginning, to contact the tribal council. And what the tribal council will do is they do have a public relations office, and they already have those connections. They'll want to know, like, what type of story are you doing? How can we help facilitate this? We want to make this the best experience for you. Maybe we should put you with a tribal program so that they can go with you and show you around. And that way it's being transparent too, in a way that we'll probably talk about later on, but in how we do stories, good stories, accurate stories. A lot of the time the tribes will hear about, oh, hey, I had people contact me like, hey, this person wants to come do a story. Do you have time on this day to show them around? And I'll be like, yeah, sure. So I'll go drive them through the reservation, show them whatnot. We did a newscast thingy where I had to take him out and show him places. And I felt comfortable with having to do that, because I don't, Wyoming's so vast, and that's probably one of the part of the question is it's so vast, and you need to know where to get gas, right? You need to know where to get food. On the reservation, there's like little stores here in between here and there, so you kind of got to know where to go. And then a part of that too is just making sure that you're writing good stories. And we'll probably talk about this later, Shalise, is where we're talking about what not to do. And that's probably something we'll talk about you know, don't find someone who wants to be considered as the informant, you know, like who, you know, write good stories where the person is like, hey, you know, this was so-and-so, they showed me around and it was a great experience, you know. So yeah, really reach out to the tribal councils, their public relations office. They'll put you in contact with people who can talk about the story. They'll put you in contact with somebody who might have time to really give you a good tour and a great experience. So reach out to them. That's what they're there for.
Thank you, Yufna. Now we're getting a lot of questions that are sort of relating to the second poll. So I'm going to review that and then bring it back to you, Yufna. So the first question, and I've closed the poll, about half of you answered it. Thank you. What percentage of media on Indigenous issues contain at least one bingo card term? So you've seen now this resource, and there's some questions about it that have stereotypical themes that journalists often cover on Indigenous communities. And over 50% of media, according to the Native American Journalists Association, have terms that come that are stereotypical, that are from this card. And 26% of those have more than one term. And that moves on to my second and third question, which was to get folks to really look at our examples of good and bad media. And these were actually provided to me by Yufna. And she has worked a lot with the media in the past when she worked as the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And it's not a surprise that the bad example comes from a national source that maybe did not have any contact with folks here on the Wind River community. And it really shows with their reporting. And so that the title of that was, and it was by the New York Times, Brutal Crimes Grip an Indian Reservation. And I asked how many terms from the bingo card were used in that story. And there were seven terms, and they were alcohol, drugs, sexual assault, unemployment, spirits, violence, and something about a reservation. So it's incredibly reductionistic and really painting a picture that is not accurate of the diversity of people and different nations living in that place. And our second example, which is a good example, was done by the Casper Star Tribune. And it was about Yufna and the Tribal Historic Preservation Office gathering remains from a boarding school. And that was done by Brendan Meyer for the Casper Star Tribune. It was published in the Casper Star Tribune. And I asked how many terms from this card did it have? And it had zero. It had zero reference to anything sacred, singing, even a reservation. And it was funny when Yufna gave these to me, she said, this one's good and this one's bad. And I had not compared them to the bingo card yet. And when I did, it was to my surprise that the good one really was good because it didn't stereotype the tribes in a way that is usually done. So Yufna, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but there was a question by somebody. I'm going to pull it up here. I have a lot of tabs open, so just forgive me, be patient, everybody. Someone asked, I was interested that the bingo card listed dancing, drumming, singers, etc. Is this because many times journalism of powwow and cultural events doesn't go deeper than coverage of these eye-catching cultural activities to talk about the larger context? Sometimes a powwow itself and the outcomes of dance contests is news, in my view. So what do you have to say to that, Yufna?
I think kind of backing up first is that the good and the bad examples that I showed you, I actually lived through this, right? I'm actually experiencing good and bad stories when I open my phone, when I'm reading newspapers, when I go to the library and see things. This is the actual experience that we're going through, is that these journalists or authors have written about the tribe. And it kind of goes back to how do we make our kids and fulfill our kids with pride when there are stories that are so negative. They know their own experiences here on the reservation, and a lot of these children, a lot of the time, 85% of the time, are trying their best to get to school like everybody else and do these various things. So when you write those stories and they're horrible, that example one, it's like they just jumped on and Googled, Wind River Reservation or Northern Arapaho or Eastern Shoshone. Everybody goes through something bad at some point in their lives. But one of the hard things is that a lot of the time, that's what we're focused about on reservations, which goes back to the bingo card. We're stereotyped so many times on and off the reservation. Even growing up in my life as being a Native American female, is dealing with that stereotype. How do I go forward? How do I progress? How do I educate myself? How do I work? Knowing that people are always going to stereotype me and the things I need to say and how I say it and how I advocate for my people. So just keep that in mind when you are interviewing people. Realize that they are real people and they are experiencing life. And so going back to the powwow, when we talk about drumming, singing, dancing, like I kind of said before, if you go to a public event and they're singing and they're dancing and they're doing contests, the internal part of that, if you were going to write a story, if you know every dancer and singer there who are competing in the contest, and you're like, hey, you're promoting these various drummers who won, so much money, that's great. That's great that you write a story about that, so people know who won that contest. The same thing with different categories. If you're talking about, hey, you're following this little girl who dances fancy shawl and you're promoting her in a way each story throughout the summer, that's great. But kind of keep in mind that, when you do go to these public events, and you write these stories, get authority to write them, work with the people you're interviewing, show reciprocity, show that you actually are investing in this story to make it the best it can be. Because so many times we have too many bad experiences of, various stories written about us that, fit that stereotype. That's what we want to step away from.
Thanks, Yufna. I'm going to move us along here to just a couple more points before our program is over. On our media guide, we have some language suggestions about how to describe sacred sites. And you've touched on this, but I'm wondering if you could be more specific about how they should be described and how photos should be used of a petroglyph, if at all, and geotagging and just how to language them.
So geotagging, never do it. One of the things with petroglyphs, right, or any site, if you're invited to go be a part of something and you see a cultural site or any traditional cultural property, make sure that you're taking off the location of the sites, because we have so many people who vandalize and destroy sites that it's appalling. Tribes can't go back and use those sites if people are destroying them. So when you publicly put it out there that, hey, there's a site here, be really aware of how you're sharing that information. A lot of the times, when I was the TIPO, I made sure that a lot of the times I had my own little policy in hand that it was okay for tribal members to take pictures, but take the location off. Because if you post it to Facebook and you go in there and you look, the location is inside those photos. So I was always making sure that to be careful about protecting sites. That's the main reason why you're taking those locations off, is to protect them and to preserve those locations. Imagery is huge, especially in social media. So make sure that you're doing that. And as far as sharing language and how to describe certain sites, think about it in this way, that if someone's going to use that location to suffer and to use those sites in fasting or vision quests or whatnot, you don't need to write it specifically that's what it's used for, because somebody will go back, they'll find the site and they'll try to loot it, they'll try to destroy it, they'll vandalize it. And we have too many sites that are important to tribes that have been destroyed. And once those sites are destroyed, the integrity and the significance to the tribes is basically gone. And there are laws that protect those sites, but a lot of the time, many people aren't ever caught vandalizing or destroying sites. So when you're talking about petroglyph sites, dwellings, a lot of the time, the general terms are just cultural resources or traditional cultural properties or traditional called landscapes or traditional cultural corridor. A lot of the time, some of the sites, if they're rock features, you could use rock features. Just places like vision quest sites or fasting sites, those are like huge don't do. Take the geocache location off, and just being really mindful, respectful, and accurate, like I said, is really important, because keep in mind, people do use those sites and the tribes hold them sacred and they are respected. So how you use the language to describe them is also important. And if you don't know, ask somebody, look at any type of resources you have and say, hey, I think it's okay if I talked about it in this way. Is that okay? I'm pretty sure somebody will have some type of edit or comment to that.
Yeah, a common theme I'm really hearing from you and both Jason throughout this training is the importance of really insourcing your data from somebody on the reservation. And if they don't know, I'm sure they'll point you to somebody. And I can't emphasize that enough. And if you don't know somebody from the reservation, man, you're really missing out. Get to know people. I have one more question here, and folks, we're about to end our program in the next few minutes. So if there are any burning questions that you have, please write them in the Q&A. And if we didn't get to them, don't worry. You have Yufna's email, and I'm sure she will be happy to direct you to someone who can answer them, or she'll give you a call, or we can connect sometime offline. But I have a question here from a participant that says, it seems to me like in the past, some Arapaho leaders had taken efforts to emphasize their alliance with the U.S. Army as scouts during the 1876 Great Sioux War. Is this still a narrative that is important to tribal leadership in contemporary journalism?
So yeah, I think it's an important role in history. But really pointing that out, do you have this this division? And keep in mind, when you write stories, there's always going to be some type of division that you're going to be consciously and unconsciously drawing when you write a story, because what you're doing, again, when you're doing the historical context, and if you think about the history of tribes, a lot of those narratives were left out. You talk about tribes and you talk about the history of why they did what they did and who they actually were. Maybe those are important contexts of the history that should be also included. So really do your research and really delve deeply inside what you're going to talk about when you talk about history. For me, I'm always trying to promote the female narrative, Indigenous side. And at no point do you ever hear stories about women in our history. So when you're going to write about the historical context of anything with the Arapaho leaders, really make sure that you're touching base with both sides of the male and the female, but also knowing that, probably a better story to something that would be using that as a source or quoting it would probably be really researching in depth about what direction you're taking with that. And just remember that a lot of the times when you talk about any of the context of history, a lot of why they were doing that was really important. hoping that we were going to receive a reservation if we were to give our time to the government was really important at that time. We thought that if we reached out and worked with them, they were going to give our own reservation, and that never happened. So whatever way and source that you're trying to cite that reference, make sure that, you know, it's really important that you do your own research. And it's probably a lot more interesting if you do put your own research into types of things that have historical context.
Great. Well, thank you, Yufna. This has been an incredible experience for me personally, and I'm sure I can speak to the participants in the training. And also thank you to Jason and Kristen for helping me navigate the moderator role, and Citizens for the Red Desert for hosting this event. Those of you that are going on the tour with us on Friday, I want to reiterate that we're leaving at 7:30, and we're going to be highlighting and visiting certain areas within the Red Desert that are important to Indigenous communities here on the reservation. And we're going to really allow for the space to have questions and open dialogue about those places that we're going to be visiting. And again, if you would like to attend, there are open spots because we just had several cancellations. Anything to close, Yufna, before I end the program?
Maybe just saying thank you to everybody. Thank you to Walt. Thanks to Shalise and Jason. Thanks to everyone who put the media guide together, and thanks to all the participants. We appreciate it. And I'm hoping that you learned something and we can move forward and write great stories about tribes and the desert. Thank you.
Bye.